Um, okay, up next, we have the Fireside Chat with myself and Marisa Lago. Marisa is the Undersecretary of International Trade. As I mentioned before, I was fortunate to meet her at Germany as part of an industry roundtable at Formnext, and saw that as an awesome opportunity to ask someone like her to join us at this event. Undersecretary Lago was appointed to the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade by President Biden and sworn in December 2021. She's responsible to lead the U.S. government's efforts to assist American businesses entering or expanding into international markets, enforce fair trade policies, promote travel and tourism to the United States, as well as U.S. products and services overseas, provide in-depth trade analyses, develop strategies that will shape the future of international trade, and engage in commercial diplomacy across the globe. She has a fascinating background. Before joining the International Trade Association, she led the New York City Department of City Planning and the City Planning Commission. In the Obama-Biden administration, she served in the Department of Treasury as Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Development. She's also served in the Director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, Chief Economic Development Officer for the City of Boston, President and CEO of the Empire State Development Corporation, Director of the Office of International Affairs for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Global Head of Compliance for a major investment bank. Finally, not only did she receive a law degree from Harvard, but she also has a bachelor's degree in physics. So I want to welcome Undersecretary Lago. Welcome to the stage. Go ahead and turn your camera and mic on. Let's see, make sure that we have no, oh, there we are, excellent. Hi there.
Hi there, Kristen. So good to see you again.
Yes, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really exciting. I'm excited for you to share. I've learned from your team over the last couple of months so many amazing things that your department does, your administration does, that I think a lot of people are really not aware of. And of course, your background in physics, going into from physics to where you are now, I think is fascinating for a lot of people as well. So thank you so much. I want to start with just to kind of as an original kickoff, for those who aren't familiar with the International Trade Administration, could you just tell us a little bit about the organization and the priorities?
Sure. The International Trade Administration, it's a mouthful, so I'll call it ITA. We have a simple mission, which is to enhance the competitiveness of U.S. industry and their workers. And we do this through a host of different ways. One is we focus on removing non-tariff barriers to trade. We spend a lot of time engaging with our counterparts outside of the U.S. in nations that present good export opportunities for U.S. companies. We talk to them about enhancing the enabling environment, making themselves more attractive for investment from the U.S. It can be things as straightforward as addressing corruption, but it also goes, we also speak with them about enhancing protection for intellectual property, having a judicial system that can resolve commercial disputes. We also engage in what we call commercial advocacy. When a U.S. business is bidding on a tender by a government outside of the U.S., and this is both the national government, but it can also be state governments, municipal governments, we will then advocate on behalf of pre-cleared U.S. companies, emphasizing the fact that by going with a U.S. bidder, it is a company that benefits from our reputation for innovation and also for integrity in business practices. We engage in commercial dialogues with countries as diverse as Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, Japan, the European Commission. In all of our discussions and activities, what we are looking to do is to level the playing field, because we know that when there's a level playing field, that U.S. companies and their workers can compete, they can win. And as part of leveling the playing field, we have a unit that focuses on enforcing trade agreements. If you've heard of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, that's done within ITA. But the part of ITA that might be most relevant to the folks on this call is that we work with US companies that are looking either to export for the first time, or if they're already exporters, looking to grow the number of countries, to grow to which they export. It makes sense that this is part of our mission because 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the US. So we do this through a network of trade specialists. We have trade specialists in over 100 locations throughout the US. Yes, the big cities, but we also have rural, what we call USACs, US Export Assistance Centers. Now, we also have a network of trade specialists in over 80 locations globally. These trade specialists know the governmental requirements, they know the formal rules, but perhaps as importantly, they know the informal rules of how business gets done in these countries around the globe. And so we are able to match deep knowledge of locations, markets, business communities in the US with the opportunities that are present overseas. And I do want to note that we have a very particular focus on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. The overwhelming majority of clients that we serve are MSMEs. We also focus on historically underserved communities, minority-owned businesses, and women-owned businesses. And I have to say, I am just absolutely thrilled to be part of a conference that so explicitly is focused on female speakers. Kudos to you, Kristen, for realizing that there was a need and for pulling this off.
Oh, I don't deserve the credit. It's a huge team effort on that one. But thank you. So our audience for this conference is obviously global, and I think these topics definitely affected on a global basis. But we obviously also have a lot of American entrepreneurs and business leaders here in this audience, I think specifically right during this time. What specific support can the ITA offer those who are thinking about expanding their businesses abroad?
Okay, so let me start with the support for US exporters. My number one bit of advice, get in touch with your local USAC, your US Export Assistance Center. What they can do, the trade experts in our USACs, they can counsel US companies about how to sell internationally. It can be scary, particularly for first-time exporters. So it's good to have an expert to speak with. They can provide in-depth market intelligence about markets outside the US. Again, as I mentioned, we have trade experts in 80 global locations. They can do matchmaking, business-to-business matchmaking. They can team up US businesses with international buyers, with potential partners. And then the other thing that they can do is address trade obstacles that an exporter has encountered. Again, taking advantage of this network of experts in these locations around the globe. To give a sense of scale, last year we assisted 40,000 clients, and about 85% of them were micro, small, or medium-sized enterprises. I would guess that some of the folks participating in your conference might be outside of the US, and we actually have some services that might be of interest to them. Part of our mission is to attract foreign direct investment into the US. Now, when you think about FDI, sometimes people think only of the big sovereign wealth funds, the major investors, but we also are interested in attracting companies of all sizes from outside the US who say, aha, I see the size of the US market, and I think that I can make it there. I think that there's an opportunity. And we do this principally through our annual Select USA conference. It's a conference held right outside Washington, D.C. that attracts thousands of participants. In one place, you can meet thousands of business participants. You can meet the economic development organizations from states and cities across the US who join with us because, as you know, we're operating at the federal level, but economic development is frequently very place-based. At this conference, which I should say is being held from the 1st to the 4th of May of this year, you can find any number of governors, of US cabinet officials, and of business leaders. And over these days of conferences, yes, there are the panels, but basically what is going on is deal making. It is the one place where a business from outside the US can just see the diversity of opportunities that we have within our economy.
That's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Because as you said, I think we do have a decent group of attendees here from outside the US, so I think that's really helpful. So obviously we're at the TIPE 3D printing conference, right? So we got to talk about 3D printing. How does the ITA engage with 3D printing and digital manufacturing in general? What are your priorities?
I think that the bread and butter work that I described before is essential to any industry, including 3D printing. So I don't want to downplay that. Collaboration with industry on a sustainable and reliable supply chain, making sure that we have free and secure data flows, leveling the playing field with competitors, and in particular with countries who don't share the free market ideals, the democratic ideals of so many of our allies and partner countries, and maintaining really robust relationships with industry. It is so important for us that we understand our industry players, the industry stakeholders, the trade organizations, the chambers of commerce, so that we can provide the most expert advice. Turning more specifically to 3D printing, we do export promotion, and last October, we had an advanced manufacturing trade mission that went to Indonesia, to Singapore, and Japan, very significant markets. And what we find is that when ITA leadership is leading the trade mission, we can get incredibly good meetings with the relevant government decision makers, with the big players in the business community, and in advance of the trade missions, we arrange the business matchmaking. If we team up the US participants in the trade mission with folks, with businesses on the ground where we think that there's the potential for a good fit. Now, something that was a lesson of the pandemic is that we've realized that we can also do virtual trade missions, or at times hybrid trade missions. So in the same way that I would suspect you have a larger participation in your conference because of the virtual format, we're taking advantage of that. And in fact, last year in the area of advanced manufacturing, did a virtual trade mission with a number of Baltic countries. The other thing that I would note are trade shows. You and I met at Formnext in Frankfurt, and we don't just show up with our trade specialists at the shows. We work with the organizers so that we can deliver trade counseling to US participants who are there. And again, we do on-site business-to-business matchmaking because everyone is in that bustling room in Frankfurt at Formnext. So the opportunity to use our trade specialists, put them to work, doing the matchmaking. Now, the other thing that I haven't yet mentioned is standards collaboration. You and I in particular met at a couple of hour forum that we had held while we were at Formnext. And it focused on some incredibly wonky topics. Participating, in addition to your participation, we had ASTM, we had ISO, we had industry leaders, we had academics, we had an expert from the European Commission. And we think that standards and collaborating with industry and like-minded partners on standards is especially important when you are in a relatively new, quickly growing field, to make sure that we will have this level playing field to make sure that the standards are not being set by countries that don't share our ideals about fair play, about the importance of intellectual property, about the importance of consumer protection. And so we look to work with like-minded groups to make sure that we set high quality standards that we can be proud of. Now, I can give you a sneak preview. You can mark your calendars for the 6th of November. It is the day before this year's Forum Next kicks off, and we will again be hosting, but this time, an all-day standards forum. We just sensed such interest in the topic that we realized that we could very usefully spend an entire day learning from the industry, collaborating with the industry. And then the final thing that I'll note is commercial diplomacy. You are in a field that is on the tip of everyone's tongue. And so it's an odd conversation that I have with a counterpart from another country where the topic of additive manufacturing doesn't come up.
Yeah, for sure. I can imagine. So I want to change gears real quick. We have only 13 minutes left, and I want to make sure we talk a little bit more about your STEM education. So before you became a policymaker, you had a very rigorous STEM education. Can you tell us a bit about this and how it's informed your work and career trajectory, especially as a woman?
Certainly, as you can imagine, entering Cooper Union's engineering school in 1973, there were not a lot of other women around. I am incredibly proud of my BS in physics. I think in part because I was fortunate enough to be my family's first college graduate, but also because of the rigor of the thinking. I went on to law school, and I sometimes joke that after Cooper Union and studying physics, I realized it would be fun to go to a trade school. I'm proud of being a lawyer, but I'm much, much prouder of my STEM background. And I also like to point out, I was a STEM girl before the term STEM was even used at the time. My physics background informs how I do every job that I've done. Even now as a senior policymaker, there is just a rigor of thinking, how I approach a problem, always looking to be fact-based. After law school, I went into real estate development and finance. And again, that was in the early 80s by then, but still overwhelmingly, it was a male field. I am very, very used to, sadly, being the only woman in the room. Now, it's a different world from when I entered. There has been an incredible amount of progress. I've had the privilege of working for a Black mayor, governor, and president, something that was unthinkable when I entered the workforce. But I did not have a female boss until I was 55 years old. And it was such a delight to finally work for a woman. And I'm actually pleased that ever since then, I have only had female bosses, including now. I work for the remarkable Gina Raimondo, who is the Secretary of Commerce. But we can't kid ourselves. We know that issues remain. And I think one that we face as women in STEM, women in the business world, is being ignored and underestimated. I have tried to turn that around and say, underestimate me, make my day, because I will always be prepared. I do think that if I could pass along an urging and advice, it is to look out for the next generation of women, invite them to take a seat at the table, amplify their voices, especially if they're being spoken over or if they're being mansplained. Give them the stretch assignment that will give them exposure and can lead to a bigger job. And to the extent that you're able, Be a mentor. Early on in my career, I wondered why these people were so much more senior were spending their time mentoring me. And when I became a mentor, I realized it is the mentor who gets so much more out of the relationship because you're investing in the future. You're seeing the possibility. Um, I have worked on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility since I entered the workforce in the early 80s. And I have to say, the focus on it has only grown over time. And I am so proud to be part of the Biden-Harris administration, of Secretary Raimondo's Commerce Department, where it is absolutely fundamental to everything that we do. Um, if I can give a small anecdote, I had the pleasure and the privilege of leading the Department of Commerce's delegation to the Farnborough International Air and Defense Show. Now, this is a very intense trade show. You're talking aerospace and you're talking defense. There were 8 of us who went there because it's a great opportunity, not just for the major big names, but for all of the small businesses that are suppliers within the supply chain of the major aerospace and defense industry. The 8 of us were chosen based on what our expertise was, our role within ITA, and all 8 of us were women. And boy, did we stand out at Farnborough.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've been there for sure. I think most of us at this conference probably have been in that situation in one way or another. I think that's fantastic advice as well about the mentorship. I did mention earlier, we have a mentorship program that we're going to be ramping up again more this coming year. And I was a mentor, and it's incredibly rewarding. And I find it's like teaching. You learn just as much from being a mentor as potentially maybe more than sometimes as being a mentee. So I love that. Just to wrap things up, can you talk a little bit more about how the ITA is specifically supporting women in business, especially in STEM fields?
Sure. You have to be intentional and explicit about it, in the way that this conference was intentional about its speaker roster. I can give just a handful of the ways that we're engaged. The one that's very personal for me is that last year I led our first ever Women in Tech trade mission. It was an amazing group of female founders and executives, and it was such a wide array of tech fields: cybersecurity, personal security, healthcare, consumer products, education, ICT. We went to 3 Western European countries. We had hundreds of prearranged B2B matchmaking meetings. We also had meetings with industry leaders. We went to Web Summit in Lisbon. But what was an added treat was that we were in each country hosted by the US ambassador to the country, and the ambassadors to the Netherlands, to Portugal, and to France were all women. And so there was, in addition to the hard work, just amazing bonding and support. Last March, we did something new at TradeWinds. TradeWinds is our single largest trade mission each year. Last year, it was in Dubai, where we had a mega business conference with thousands of participants. And then following the business summit, there were trade missions to countries throughout the Gulf and North Africa that the participants could choose to go on. For the first time, we held a parallel and fully integrated program that was focusing on entrepreneurs and businesswomen, both from the US who traveled there, but we also brought in entrepreneurs and businesswomen from throughout the Gulf and North Africa. And we provided skills training. An example, how to protect your intellectual property, something that is important to practically every business person. There was networking on a grand scale. The participants in the female-focused program were able to network with the plethora of companies, large and small, that were there for the TradeWinds conference. In Europe, we've teamed up with AmCham Europe and with AmChams in countries throughout Europe on an Empower Her initiative. In each country, it takes a slightly different flavor because obviously you have to address the realities of each different market. We have a program called Select Global Women in Tech that matches founders and executives of innovative women-led firms outside of the US with female, very seasoned female tech executives in the US. And the idea is to provide these non-US women with advice on business development and how they can invest in the US. We have in the Indo-Pacific, where we are very engaged with a group of 14 countries under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We have, and this is Secretary Raimondo's genius, she was able to get 14 major US companies to commit to provide digital upskilling to 7 million women and girls in the middle and low income IPEF countries. And that would be India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. The commitment to the 7 million, which is just such a big number, is over 10 years. But this was just announced 4 months ago already. 600 female educators in Thailand have been taught how to create digital books and video content for their classes. 50,000 women throughout the region are taking courses in cybersecurity under a See Yourself in Cyber campaign. And these are free. This is part of how we in the US government, hand in hand with the business community, is showing our investment in this important region of the world. I think we have to be realistic. The challenges of being a woman in STEM, of being a woman in business, have been around for decades and I'd say centuries. So I don't think we should kid ourselves. We're not going to solve this in a year or even in a generation, but that shouldn't weaken our resolve. I think we have to realize that addressing this is so deep-seated that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And so we have to take an all-of-the-above approach to it. And if you would let me end with a little bit of a commercial. If you're in the US, all you have to do is type trade.gov into your browser, and you will go right to ITA's homepage. And if you then search for women's global trade empowerment, you will find a whole host of business information about women business-focused programs, on-demand training, links to resource partners, and my single favorite part is feature stories about successful women exporters.
I can't imagine adding anything to that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I knew this was going to be an interesting fireside chat, but I didn't realize it would be quite as inspiring as it has been as well. So thank you so much, Undersecretary Lago. We really were just thrilled to have you. And thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Truly my pleasure. Bye.
All right.